permanent members, including the present E10, does not provide the checks and balances to the issues related to P5-E10 dynamics. Why then has the UFC model not taken this into consideration? Times have changed and the world today is a multipolar one. There needs to be a new logic to the permanent category composition if it were to continue. We don't operate on the basis of vetoes in the United Nations General Assembly. When asking for an impossible consensus preceding text-based negotiations, isn't the UFC just vetoing the whole process and suggesting a my way or the highway approach? Permanent members, including the present E10, does not provide the checks and balances to the issues related to P5-E10 dynamics. It would continue to be a binary P5 and an E22 straddling the same issues. As things stand, a majority of the P5 members themselves agree that expansion in both the permanent and the non-permanent categories of the United Nations Security Council is the only way to redeem the Council for the 21st century. Why then? Why then has the UFC model not taken this into consideration? This is something that my delegation would like to understand. Fourth, we need to be abreast of a sense of realism that the current permanent members were the product of the geopolitical context of the 20th century. Times have changed and the world today is a multipolar one. There needs to be a new logic to the permanent category composition if it were to continue, and that cannot work without changes. That is, an expansion in the permanent category so as to strike, and I quote from the UFC model, the right balance between the representativeness and the efficiency of the Council. Fifth, we have not heard anything on text-based negotiations within a fixed time frame in the UFC model yet again today. No real surprise. We have the models out for all member states to see. To say, let us agree before we start negotiations is like giving every member country a veto. And while vetoes may be used in the United Nations Security Council, we don't operate on the basis of vetoes in the United Nations General Assembly. Thus, when asking for an impossible consensus preceding text-based negotiations, isn't the UFC just vetoing the whole process and suggesting a my way or the highway approach? The UFC model asks for flexibility from member states. We have said this before, and we say so again, that we are ready and willing to negotiate and be flexible in a setting where every member state is ready to give and take. My question is, why is the UFC not ready to give and take on its proposal? Sixth, as many small states have repeatedly pointed out, that these intermediate models, such as those put forth by the UFC, merely enhance the chances of more resourceful middle states to contest in both the so-called semi-permanent and the non-permanent category, thereby further reducing the chances of small states to serve on the Council. In short, expansion of non-permanent membership is a solution which adds to the size without addressing the malaise that afflicts the Council, by way of a non-representative character, a relic of the post-1945 world order. Thus, to summarize, in our view, the UFC proposal for expansion only in the non-permanent category is afflicted with the following problems. It does not provide any checks or balances to the current issues related to the imbalances between the permanent members and the non-permanent members. It would not empower Africa or other developing countries. It would mean introduction of a new category and addition of numbers without making the Council either accountable or effective. That accountability can come about only by having new permanent members elected and subject to a stringent review. Also, co-chairs, to bring in some perspective on the intermediate model. It is often proposed as a new and innovative solution. Unfortunately, it is older than the United Nations itself. This very idea was sought to be introduced in the UN Charter at the founding of the United Nations and was discarded then for a lack of suitability and efficacy. For example, an effort was specifically mounted to amend the Dumbarton Oaks draft with a proposal for non-permanent membership for 8 years. This was termed then as semi-permanent membership. The matter was discussed in detail in Committee 1 of Commission 3, dealing with parts of the Charter related to the Security Council structure and procedure. On 14 May 1945, it was rejected by an overwhelming majority. Subsequently, just 2 days later, an effort was made to provide for opportunities for re-election of non-permanent members on completion of their 2-year terms. These efforts too were rejected outright by all except 2 members. In short, the idea that underpins these models is, to use a well-known colloquialism, old wine, albeit perhaps being served to us today in a new bottle. On the veto, the UFC calls for negotiations on how to best limit the use of the veto, which we align with. However, my delegation would like to reiterate that the veto evolves from the fact that the permanent category exists. Nevertheless, the UFC model, while calling for comprehensive Security Council reform across 5 thematic clusters, leaves the permanent category untouched. Isn't this a piecemeal approach, choosing to half reform one of the major clusters? My delegation's principal position on this aligns with the African and L69 positions, that the veto as a matter of principle should be abolished. But as long as there is a permanent category and as long as there are countries that wield the veto, as a matter of common justice, it should be extended to new permanent members so long as it continues to exist. And co-chairs, if only expanding the category of non-permanent members could have helped, the world would have been a better place. Since the last cycle of reforms to the United Nations Security Council, which was pursued in the 1960s and the 1970s. For my delegation, the equitable representation of the Global South and Africa in the permanent category is a non-negotiable. The African Union became a member of the G20 during India's presidency last year. We should hope that the United Nations, a much older institution, would take some inspiration from this change. Co-chairs, India, as a delegation that has piloted the need for reformed multilateralism, fully supports any initiative that genuinely furthers the objective of achieving meaningful and comprehensive reform of the key elements of the global multilateral architecture. We look forward to text-based negotiations once the individual model discussions end, since now we all know where each member state and grouping stands. And as we get ready for the Summit of the Future later this year and to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the United Nations next year, it is imperative to bring the structure and composition of the Security Council in line with contemporary geopolitical realities through its comprehensive reform across the 5 clusters of categories of membership, the question of the veto, regional representation, the size of an enlarged Security Council, improving the working methods of the Security Council, as well as improving the Security Council's relationship with the General Assembly. Co-chairs, our leaders have repeatedly tasked us with delivering an early and comprehensive reform of the Security Council, a task which over the years of textless, fruitless deliberations in the IGN remains not only unfulfilled, but have technically been vetoed by a few member states by asking for consensus. Mind you, a consensus even before negotiations begin. In effect, a vocal minority of naysayers have held the entire process of Security Council reform hostage over the last 4 decades. And it is ironical that the same set of member states who argue vociferously against piecemeal reform in the IGN are today in this meeting themselves supporting a piecemeal model, which ignores the root cause of the problem. This is one of the major problems with the Mexican and Liechtenstein models, also focusing only on aspects of categories of membership and working methods of the Council. I'm afraid such an approach does not augur well with the majority of member states who wish to actually reform the Council to make it fit for purpose. Let me conclude, co-chairs, by pointing out that the number of UN member states has grown fourfold. Threats to international peace and security have become more complex, more unpredictable, and more undefined. The world of the 21st century desperately needs a UN 2.0 that is credible, that is representative, that is reflecting the needs and aspirations of the member states and is capable of maintaining, indeed maintaining international peace and security. Achieving that result requires adapting the Council to the new global realities that we face. My delegation stands ready to work with one and all to achieve that end objective of a better tomorrow for our future generations.